Welcome back to the deep dive. We take complex source material, break it down, and synthesize it so you get the key insights, fast and well informed. Today, we're diving into something pretty unique. It's an experiment, really, in historical analysis, looking at the late imperial world through travel writing, but using some very cutting-edge AI methods.
That's right. The source material is this fascinating study. It tackled a huge amount of text, 3,282 pages, to be exact, of travel writing from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We're talking 1879 to 1922. And it wasn't just one region. It spanned the globe. The Americas, Arabia, Asia, Australasia, Africa. Really comprehensive.
Wow, 3,282 pages. That's not just a snapshot. That's a panoramic view of how the West was seeing and describing the world during peak colonialism and industrial growth.
Exactly. And the texts themselves are really varied. You've got things like Isabel Burton's Reflections from 1879, which have this early feminist moral angle, all the way up to someone like H. St. John Philby in 1922, writing about Arabia with a kind of proto-geopolitical focus.
So a huge range. Now, the study argues something pretty radical about these texts, doesn't it? It's not just about treating them as, historical diaries or factual accounts.
No, absolutely not. That's the whole point. The study uses this framework called the General World Theory, or GWT. And GWT completely flipped the script on how we read these narratives.
Okay, GWT. So what's the big shift? What's the core idea?
The core idea is that these travel narratives aren't passive records at all. They are active sites of world-making.
World-making, meaning they weren't just finding a world, they were, defining it, constructing it. Precisely. The study puts it very directly. Description is creation. When these travelers chose what to write about, the words they used, the moral judgments they made, the economic systems they just sort of accepted or explained.
They were actively building the world. They claimed they were just observing. They were embedding power dynamics, naturalizing hierarchies, basically constructing the intellectual framework of the imperial world order.
That's a really powerful claim. And it makes you think about this sheer scale. If these ideas, these biases, these justifications are woven through over 3,000 pages, how did one researcher even begin to analyze all of that systematically?
Right, and that's where the methodology becomes so crucial. Analyzing that volume of text through a complex lens like GWT, dimension by dimension. Traditionally, that's almost impossible. So the mission for this deep dive is really to explore that methodology, this experimental AI-augmented approach they developed, what they call augmented hermeneutics.
Okay, let's unpack this methodology. That sounds like the core innovation here. We need to understand what makes it new, how other researchers might be able to use or adapt it, and crucially, what kinds of insights this method actually managed to uncover from those old texts.
Right, so before we get into the nuts and bolts of the AI method, let's just ground ourselves a bit more in the actual text they looked at. This period, 1879 to 1922, it's such a pivotal time. You've got global empires, new technologies, massive changes happening everywhere. Absolutely. And the diversity of the sources reflects that. It's not just one type of travel writing. You have really practical guides like Hittell's Handbook of Pacific Coast Travel from 1887. That one's full of details, climate, mining economies in Western North America, comparing different regions. Yeah. Very practical stuff.
Okay, so guidebooks on one end. What else?
Then you have something like Arnold and Frost's The American Egypt from 1909. That one's fascinating because it mixes archaeology looking at ancient Mayan sites in the Yucatan with, what you might call economic ethnography. It focuses really heavily on the modern exploitation of henequen, sisal hemp. So the ancient past is right there alongside the contemporary resource extraction, never separate.
So the history and the current economic reality are intertwined in the narrative itself.
Exactly. And others map out these huge global journeys. Clark's Our Journey Around the World, for instance, it tracks interactions across Asia, the Pacific, lots of focus on missionary work and cultural assimilation, or Macmillan's A Journey to Java, which gives this detailed, though deeply biased view of the Dutch colonial setup there, the economy, the society.
So despite all this variety, practical guides, archaeology, missionary accounts, economic observations, what ties them all together? Why group these specific texts?
Well, the study argues that what connects them is their shared function. They were all, in different ways, defining the world for a Western audience. They were all participating in that larger world-making project we talked about. Even the practical details, the climate charts, the sailing times, they exist within that framework of exploration, administration, and often exploitation.
Okay, so you have this sprawling, diverse data set from a really complex historical period. You need a theoretical toolkit that can actually handle that complexity, right? Something that can connect the dots between, say, Java and the Yucatan. That's where GWT comes in.
That's precisely its role. GWT general world theory acts as this kind of meta framework. Its main job is to refuse to separate what traditional history often keeps apart.
It is.
The material dimension, so physical stuff, economics, geography, climate, the epistemic dimension, how people know things, what counts as truth, different belief systems, and the ethical dimension, the moral consequences of how things are described and structured. GWT insists these three are always interconnected.
So it's about seeing the world as this dynamic relational system, knowing, being, ethics, all tangled up.
Exactly. Instead of seeing the archive as just a collection of facts in a museum, GWT turns it into this living inquiry. You're looking at the relationships, the tensions, the codependencies.
And the study used specific dimensions from GWT to structure the analysis, right? There were 9, but maybe we focus on the key ones that really drove the insights.
Yeah, focusing on 4 gives a really good sense of it. First, there's interdependence. This is the idea that nothing exists in isolation. Everything affects everything else. Systems co-arise. So you can't understand, say, the ecology of Java without understanding the demands of the Dutch export market forcing certain crops to be grown. Climate and labor aren't separate issues, they're completely interdependent.
Okay, interdependence. Got it. What's next?
Second, pluralism. This one's about acknowledging that there's no single ultimate worldview that explains everything. Western science, indigenous knowledge, religious doctrine, they all offer different perspectives on reality, and none of them has a monopoly on truth. And these different worldviews often clash, right? Right. Especially in these colonial encounters.
Right, clashes over what's real or how things work. Pluralism, then there was entanglement. That sounds relevant to the actual objects and places travelers described.
Yes, entanglement. This dimension says that matter, mind, and meaning are fundamentally inseparable. An object isn't just its physical properties. Think of a mountain. Geologically, it's rock. But it might also be a sacred site for one group, a source of valuable minerals for another, a strategic border for a government. Its material existence is saturated with meaning, history, and often conflict.
So the physical thing carries all this other stuff with it. Okay,
Yeah.
And the last one. You said it was the most ethically critical. That's ethical praxis. This brings us right back to that core idea. Description is creation. Ethical praxis insists that how we describe the world actively shapes that world.
It means a traveler's words, their choices of what to highlight or ignore, are never neutral. They have real consequences. Describing a people as primitive or an exploitative system as necessary progress isn't just an observation. It's an act that justifies and helps perpetuate a particular moral reality.
So analyzing the archive through GWT isn't just about finding facts, it's about understanding the moral economy of how the imperial world was built, description by description.
Precisely. GWT transforms the archive into this complex web of ethical and relational dynamics that the researcher has to carefully unpack.
Okay, so we have this really rich, complex theory, GWT, with its focus on interdependence, pluralism, ethics, and we have this mountain of text over 3,000 pages. The big question is, how do you actually apply GWT systematically to all that material? That sounds like an overwhelming task for a human researcher alone.
It absolutely would be.
Yeah.
Trying to manually track, say, every instance of interdependence between climate and labor across 7 dense books, I mean, you could spend years and still miss connections. This is exactly where the methodological innovation comes in. They needed a way to bridge traditional humanistic reading, which is all about nuance and deep understanding, with the kind of scale and pattern recognition that digital tools can offer.
And that bridge is what they called augmented hermeneutics.
That's the term they use, yes. Augmented hermeneutics. Here's where it gets really interesting. They framed the AI not just as a tool, but as a kind of partner in the research. An epistemic interlocutor, I think was the phrase. What did that actually mean in practice? How did they do it? Okay, so it was a multi-step process and very deliberately structured. First, they loaded the entire corpus, all 3,282 pages, into a specialized platform. The study used NotebookLM. This wasn't just a simple search engine. NotebookLM became the main interface for interpretation. The key thing is, the researcher wasn't just throwing random keywords at it. They were systematically querying the entire dataset through the specific lenses of the GWT dimensions.
So literally asking structured questions based on the theory, like, show me examples across all these texts where pluralism leads to conflict over resources, or
Sure.
How is the concept of ethical praxis discussed in relation to non-human beings? Stuff like that.
Exactly like that. really specific, theory-driven questions. And NotebookLM's job was to go through all 3,282 pages and pull out relevant passages, synthesize initial summaries, identify potential patterns related to that GWT dimension. This first step generated a massive amount of raw but structured output. It basically made the huge corpus manageable and analyzable through the GWT framework.
Okay, so NotebookLM handles the heavy lifting of searching and initial structuring based on the GWT queries. What about the other AI tools mentioned, like ChatGPT and Claude? What was their role?
Right, they came in at the next stage, the secondary interpretation and synthesis phase. While NotebookLM is great for that structured querying within the corpus, the more advanced large language models, like GPT-4 or Claude 3 Opus back then, are particularly good at higher-level tasks. Things like spotting thematic connections across really diverse bits of text, clustering similar ideas, helping to identify those transversal links, the patterns that might show up in a description of Arabia and in a handbook about the Pacific Coast. Their role was more about helping the human researcher organize and make sense of the initial output from NotebookLM, seeing the bigger picture emerge.
So the AI isn't discovering new historical facts buried in the text, but it's helping the researcher see the connections and the systemic coherence across the whole data set, like mapping the underlying logic of the imperial mindset as it appears across different contexts.
That's a great way to put it. It helps operationalize GWT's idea of relational knowing. The AI acts like a tireless research assistant or a sounding board. It can surface potential connections across thousands of pages that a human might easily miss or only spot after months of reading. It helps make the relational structure visible.
But okay, whenever we talk about using these big AI models in research, especially humanities research, the alarm bells start ringing, right? What about bias in the AI? What about the AI just making stuff up, hallucinations? How did they make sure the analysis was actually rigorous and grounded in the texts, not just reflecting the AI's training data? That's the absolute crucial point, and the researchers were very explicit about this. The entire method hinges on one core principle. The human researcher always remains the primary interpretive authority.
It's built on continuous human supervision, critical questioning, and reflexivity. The AI's outputs, the patterns it suggests, the summaries it generates, were treated essentially as hypotheses. They needed to be constantly checked, verified against the original texts, contextualized, and interpreted by the human expert, guided by the GWT framework and its ethical commitments.
So it's genuinely augmented interpretation, not automated interpretation. The human is the pilot, the AI is the maybe advanced navigation system.
Exactly. The human provides the direction, the critical judgment, the ethical compass. The AI provides scale, speed, and the ability to process information in ways that humans can't, or at least not easily across such a vast corpus.
And the main benefit was being able to systematically apply those 9 GWT dimensions across the entire 3,282 pages, something that would be practically impossible otherwise.
That's the key advantage. It allowed them to move beyond anecdotal evidence and see the systemic nature of the world-making project, to see how ideas about climate, race, labor, morality, and technology were interconnected across continents, reinforcing each other within this imperial logic. The method helped transform the archive from a collection of separate stories into a coherent, if deeply problematic, world system.
Now, because this was experimental, they were also upfront about the method's limitations, weren't they? What did they identify as areas needing refinement?
Yes, they were commendably reflexive about that. 2 main limitations stood out in this initial version. First, the way the AI synthesized information sometimes led to a loss of precise bibliographic granularity, meaning it might generate a really insightful point about, say, how nature was used to justify exploitation, drawing examples from multiple texts, but it wouldn't always automatically pinpoint the exact book and page number for every single contributing phrase in that synthesis.
Ah, okay. So you get the synthesized pattern, which is valuable, but if you wanted to quote the original source precisely, you might need to do some extra digging to find the exact page.
Correct. They noted that while all the sources were public domain, making this ethically okay for this experiment, future iterations of the method absolutely need to build in prompts that ensure that citation precision is maintained throughout the process. That's crucial for scholarly rigor.
Makes sense. What was the second main limitation?
The second was more fundamental, and it reinforces the augmented, not automated point. They stress that while this LLM-augmented approach is incredibly powerful for revealing large-scale patterns and connections, it cannot replace the need for deep contextual knowledge and traditional close reading. The AI doesn't understand history or culture or nuance in the human sense. Its insights are only as good as the prompts it's given, the theoretical framework guiding it, GWT, and the critical interpretation applied by the human researcher. It's a powerful collaborator, but the human scholar remains indispensable.
All right, so we understand the method, this augmented hermeneutics, combining human expertise with AI scale, guided by GWT. Let's get to the payoff. What did this approach actually reveal about that colonial world? You mentioned it showed systemic asymmetries. Let's start with that GWT dimension of interdependence, maybe looking at the example from Java.
Okay, the Java example, primarily drawn from Macmillan's book, is, frankly, chilling. It perfectly illustrates how descriptions in these narratives actively work to justify really profound structural violence. It centers on the Dutch colonial policy known as the culture system.
The culture system. What was that, basically?
Basically, it was an economic policy dictated by global market demand. It forced Javanese farmers to switch huge portions of their land away from growing rice, their staple food crop, to cultivate export cash crops instead. Things like coffee, sugar, indigo, stuff that was valuable back in Europe. So right away, you see interdependence.
Yeah.
European market demands directly reshaping the landscape and the food supply in Java.
Exactly. Vast areas of essential rice paddies were converted into plantations, and the result was predictable and horrific. Widespread, catastrophic famine. The study references estimates that this policy, this human-made shift in agriculture, led to the deaths of perhaps 500,000 Javanese people, not from drought or blight, but from policy.
500,000. That's staggering. And how did the travel narrative, the description, play into justifying this? This is where ethical praxis comes in. Precisely. This is where the description is creation idea becomes terrifyingly clear. The study found that the travel writing often obscured or rationalized this mass starvation by focusing on the aesthetics of the landscape. The writer might marvel at Java's lushness, its transformation into a Garden of Eden filled with these flourishing export crops, the coffee bushes, the sugarcane fields. This visual abundance, this ecological success of the land, was then framed as an improvement, even a blessing in disguise, for the island's vegetation.
Wait, so the beauty of the plantations was used to morally excuse the starvation of the people who used to farm there?
That's exactly how the ethical framing worked. The success of the non-human environment was implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, used to justify the immense human cost. Environment and ethics were tangled together in service of the colonial economic project. The description created a reality where ecological beauty somehow outweighed mass death.
That is deeply disturbing. It shows how GWT helps uncover that hidden moral logic. We see a similar kind of intertwining of environment and exploitation, though maybe more localized. In the Americas example, right? In the Yucatan.
Yes, the Yucatan case, detailed in The American Egypt, shows a kind of weaponized geography. The key factor there is geology. The Yucatan Peninsula naturally doesn't have many surface rivers. Water is primarily accessed through these natural underground wells called cenotes. The study revealed how this natural feature was deliberately exploited by the landowners running the henequen plantations, the sisal farms, to maintain a system of indigenous serfdom.
How did the lack of surface water translate into labor control? It's brutally simple. Control the water, control the people. All the accessible cenotes were located on the hacienda lands controlled by the landlords. This meant that the indigenous laborers, the serfs, were physically tethered to the plantations. If they tried to flee into the surrounding dry, dense scrubland, they wouldn't survive long without access to water. So a natural geological limitation was turned into the primary enforcement mechanism for a system that was effectively slavery. Again, you see GWT's interdependence. Geology, economics, social structure, all procreating this inescapable system. Incredible. The augmented method could consistently pick up these patterns, connecting Java and the Yucatan through this lens of interdependence and ethically dubious descriptions. What about the other GWT dimensions, like pluralism, the clash of worldviews?
There's a really stark example of pluralism in action in H. St. John Philby's account from Arabia in 1922. Philby arrives, the typical Western explorer figure, armed with his scientific instruments, barometers, thermometers, survey equipment. And he immediately runs up against the dominant local belief system, the conservative Wahhabi doctrine.
And what was the conflict point there? What couldn't they agree on?
The Wahhabi worldview strictly prohibited trying to uncover what they called hidden things, knowledge considered solely the domain of God. This explicitly included trying to predict future events, like the events of the morrow, or very specifically forecasting the fall of rain. For them, that was divine knowledge, not for humans to probe.
Ah, so Philby showing up with his weather forecasting tools was basically sacrilege, a direct challenge to their fundamental understanding of the world.
Exactly. It was an epistemological clash. And Philby, in his narrative, makes no secret of whose system he thinks is superior. He writes about vindicating Western books of science, asserting the authority of his nautical almanac and meteorological predictions over religious belief. It's a microcosm of the larger colonial project, not just controlling land and resources, but imposing a Western way of knowing, dismissing and delegitimizing indigenous or traditional frameworks as superstition.
But even as they were imposing their worldview, the study found they couldn't entirely escape the power of other meaning systems, right? That's where entanglement comes in. The Kohinoor diamond example, yes, the Kohinoor diamond is a perfect case study for entanglement, how matter and meaning stick together. The travel narratives obviously document its material aspects, its geology, where it was mined, the Golconda mines, its enormous monetary value, the cutting process, all the facts.
But the augmented analysis showed that these factual descriptions were almost always presented alongside, or in tension with, the deeply held belief across the East that this diamond was cursed. That it was the accursed stone, bringing disaster and bloodshed to whoever possessed it.
So the travelers had to acknowledge this other layer of meaning, even if they perhaps dismissed it. The diamond wasn't just a valuable rock, it carried this heavy historical and metaphysical weight.
Precisely. Its material reality, its incredible value derived from its geological rarity, and the labor that extracted it was inseparable in the narratives from the centuries of violence, conquest, and perceived misfortune associated with its history. The AI method helped trace how these two seemingly separate domains, the material economic and the symbolic historical metaphysical, were constantly entangled in the descriptions. The gem's physical presence was burdened by the cruelty of empire. Let's shift to another GWT dimension, becoming. This one deals with change, evolution, progress over time. How did that play out across the 1879-1922 period in these texts? The analysis showed a really strong trend. The idea of progress or civilization became almost completely tied to the adoption of Western technology. A nation's or culture's place in the world hierarchy was increasingly judged by how quickly and enthusiastically it embraced Western inventions.
And Japan often came out looking good in that comparison.
Yes, Japan was frequently held up as the model. Travelers praised Japan for adopting every new invention, every latest labor-saving contrivance. This narrative positioned Japan as successfully becoming modern, earning its place among the developed nations. China, on the other hand, was often criticized for its perceived resistance to change, its stolid self-conceit, its reliance on traditional methods symbolized by things like the wheelbarrow. This description wasn't neutral. It functioned to justify Western influence and intervention, framing China as needing to be pushed into modernity.
And the ultimate symbol of this technological modernity was the railway, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The railway appears again and again as this transformative force, both literally and symbolically. It was seen as more powerful than missionaries or schools in breaking down old ways. In India, for example, travelers noted how railways forced people of different castes into shared carriages, physically disrupting traditional social boundaries. It opened up access to remote religious sites, changing pilgrimage patterns. Even in a place as ancient and sacred as Jerusalem, the arrival of the French railway was described as an incongruous modernism, but one that had to be accepted because utility trumped sentiment. It was a physical manifestation of becoming.
It's fascinating how applying GWT systematically reveals these underlying value systems so clearly. But thinking about ethical praxis again, was it all just justification and hierarchy? Did the method find any countercurrents, any moments of critique from within these elite Western perspectives?
That's a really important question. And yes, it did. The analysis particularly highlighted Lady Isabel Burton, writing back in 1879, as a really significant, though complex, ethical voice within the corpus. Her passionate advocacy against vivisection, her efforts to actually establish humane societies for animals in places like Egypt and Syria. This stands out. It reads like an early form of interspecies ethics, a real precursor to modern animal rights concerns.
Yeah.
She wasn't just observing. She was actively trying to change moral systems on the ground.
Interesting. And what was her reasoning? Was it just, Victorian sentimentality about pets?
No, the analysis showed it was much deeper than that, linking back to entanglement again. Her arguments were grounded in theology and philosophy. She argued for a kind of spiritual kinship, asserting that humans and animals share the capacity for suffering. She famously challenged the Cartesian idea of animals as mere machines. She wrote something like, if their shrieks under experimentation don't signify real pain, then the whole of nature is one enormous lie. And she acted on it, lobbying officials like the Khedive in Cairo to actually implement fines for animal cruelty. Her narrative moved from description to active ethical intervention.
That's a fascinating wrinkle within the broader colonial context, a different kind of ethical praxis emerging.
It is. And related to that, the study also picked up on her surprisingly early ecological observations. She noted, for instance, that the construction and traffic on the Suez Canal seemed to be changing local weather patterns affecting rainfall and wind. It's a subtle point, but it signals an emerging awareness, even back then, of potentially large-scale human impacts on the environment, what we'd now call anthropogenic effects. So even as the larger imperial project was reshaping the globe, sometimes quite destructively, there were these flickers of awareness about the consequences.
So the method worked. Augmented hermeneutics, guided by GWT, successfully unearthed these deep, often disturbing connections within the colonial narratives, linking ecology to famine, geology to serfdom, technology to civilizational hierarchy. This sounds like more than just findings. It sounds like a potential blueprint for future research. Did the study explicitly talk about how others could build on this?
Yes, absolutely. A major part of the study was not just demonstrating the method, but also outlining how it could be refined and extended. They were very clear about this being an experimental prototype. So the first set of recommendations focuses on enhancing the methodology itself, particularly the digital side of it. The initial experiment was great at identifying these broad transversal themes that cut across the corpus. But to get more precise and potentially quantify some of these patterns, they suggest integrating more established quantitative digital humanities, or DH techniques.
Okay, quantitative DH methods. What specific tools did they suggest would complement the LLM analysis? They pointed to two main areas as being particularly promising: topic modeling and network visualization. Topic modeling, that's the technique that finds hidden themes in large text collections, right? How would that add to what the LLM already did?
Right. Topic modeling works statistically, looking for words that tend to appear together frequently. It could help to formally identify and perhaps even measure the prevalence of some of the complex themes the LLM helps surface qualitatively. For instance, remember the Java example. The LLM might identify the pattern of ecological description being used to justify economic exploitation. Topic modeling could potentially quantify this by finding statistically significant clusters of words, maybe terms related to lushness, profit, labor, famine, sugar, coffee, appearing together consistently across different texts. It could help map the semantic field of, say, economic cruelty, even when the authors didn't use that exact phrase.
Okay, so it adds a layer of quantitative validation to the qualitative insights and network visualization. How does that fit with GWT's focus on relationships and entanglement?
Network visualization is perfect for mapping relationships, connections between people, places, concepts, systems. You could take the relational structures that GWT posits and the LLM helps identify and make them visually explicit. Think about the Kohinoor diamond again. Network visualization could map the entire chain of entanglement, connecting the geological source, the mine, to the economic actors, miners, traders, rulers, to the material object, the diamond, to the associated concepts, value, curse, power, suffering, and the historical events, conquests, transfers. It would visually represent the web of interdependence GWT talks about.
So it literally draws the connections that the augmented hermeneutics method helped uncover conceptually.
Exactly. It makes that relational ontology tangible, visible. And crucially, addressing that earlier limitation, they stress that future work must refine the LLM prompting to rigorously maintain bibliographic precision. Every synthesized insight needs to be traceable back to the specific source text and page number automatically. That's key for building reliable scholarly arguments on this foundation.
Makes sense. So those are improvements to the method itself. But the study also acknowledged that the archive they used, while large, had its own biases, right? Mainly Western, elite, often male voices. How did they suggest addressing that?
Yes, that was a critical point of self-reflection. To truly use this method for decolonial scholarship, simply refining the technique isn't enough. You have to broaden the archive itself. The current corpus gives an incredibly detailed map of the colonial gaze, how the West saw the rest. But we desperately need the reciprocal gaze. So a major future direction is to actively seek out and include non-Western perspectives. Find travel accounts from, say, Japanese scholars visiting Europe, or Indian merchants traveling in Africa, or Arab intellectuals describing America during the same period.
Comparing those different perspectives using the same GWT framework? That would be fascinating.
It would fundamentally reshape the understanding of these global encounters. It moves beyond just critiquing the colonial voice to understanding the multi-directional nature of observation and world-making. And alongside that, even within the existing colonial framework, there's a need to deliberately foreground subaltern voices. Moving beyond the famous explorers and administrators like the Burtons and Philbys, we need to search for and incorporate narratives from women outside the elite circles, from colonized peoples themselves where such accounts exist, even if fragmented or mediated, from non-aristocratic travelers. This brings in alternative ways of knowing, alternative ethical frameworks that were often ignored or suppressed by the dominant narratives.
And beyond broadening the types of voices, what about the time frame? Sticking
hmm
to 1879, 1922 gives a specific snapshot, but things changed.
Right. The third suggestion for expansion is temporal expansion. Apply the GWT framework and the augmented method to travel, writing, and related texts from later periods in the mid-20th century, during decolonization, the Cold War era, the late 20th century with the rise of caste tourism. Tracing how themes like interdependence, technological progress, or ethical encounters evolved or didn't evolve after the formal end of empires would be incredibly revealing. Did the underlying epistemic architecture, as the study calls it, persist in new forms?
So the ultimate contribution isn't just the findings about colonial travelogues or even just the specific AI method. It's GWT as a flexible, transdisciplinary framework and augmented hermeneutics as a prototype methodology for applying it.
Precisely. The study positions itself as a proof of concept for comparative GWT applications. Imagine using this structured relational lens, perhaps combined with tailored AI augmentation, to analyze completely different kinds of texts. Scientific field reports, letters from missionaries, colonial government memos, maybe even contemporary documents like international development reports or corporate sustainability statements. Testing GWT's ability to reveal hidden interdependencies and ethical dimensions across genres is key to understanding its broader relevance.
It really suggests a way forward for tackling the sheer volume of information we face today in many fields without losing that critical, ethical, humanistic perspective.
I think so. It models a way for technology to serve deep humanistic inquiry rather than replacing it, as long as that human critical faculty remains firmly in the driver's seat. And they propose one final, really powerful ethical extension: participatory reinterpretation. The idea that future research using these methods shouldn't just be academics analyzing texts about certain communities. Instead, it should actively involve engaging with descendant communities, the people whose ancestors might be described or misrepresented in these colonial archives, to co-create interpretations. Giving them a voice in analyzing and challenging the historical narrative, that's a crucial step towards decolonizing the archive itself.
That's a really vital point. Making the methodology itself embody the ethical principles of GWT. It's a powerful vision for how to do this kind of historical work responsibly. Hashtag tag outro.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this really thought-provoking study on colonial travel narratives and the AI-augmented method used to analyze them. To quickly synthesize, we saw how the researchers used augmented hermeneutics, guided by the general world theory, to systematically analyze thousands of pages of text. And this process proved GWT's core argument that the world operates as a system of deep entanglement. Yeah, and that those travelers from 1879 to 1922 weren't just passive observers. They were actively involved in world-making. Their descriptions helped construct the moral justifications, the economic rationales, and the knowledge hierarchies of empire. The method laid bare how things like ecological descriptions could mask famine in Java, or how geology could be weaponized to enforce serfdom in the Yucatan. It showed the mechanics of empire building at the level of language and description.
And the chilling takeaway is that we don't just inherit the roads and railways and borders from that era, we also inherit the ways of thinking, the epistemic architecture. That justified it all.
Exactly, which gives this historical research profound relevance for us today. It forces us to be more critical about the descriptions we encounter and the ones we produce ourselves. The study leaves us with a really crucial question, one to maybe mull over. How do our own contemporary descriptions, the way we talk about climate change, about migration, about new technologies, about difference, how do those descriptions actively shape the world we live in now and the kinds of futures we are making possible, or perhaps closing off?
We can't escape the act of world making through language, it seems. But this work suggests we can and absolutely must strive to do it more consciously, more ethically, and acknowledging more perspectives. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.